Imagine waking up in a hyper-connected modern city and suddenly your debit card just does not work. Your business is forced to only accept physical cash, and your local government simply cannot afford to keep the neighborhood health clinics open. Or imagine living in a desert nation where a single military strike threatens to completely turn off the drinking water for millions of people. Welcome to the Clarence Ratio Daily World Brief for Sunday, July 19th, 2026. For this episode, we are looking at how modern warfare and domestic governance are actively breaking the physical and legal realities of your everyday life. You can find this briefing and more available at clarineratio.com.
We're tracking 4 distinct global developments for this briefing. We are covering the escalating direct military confrontation between the United States and Iran, the internal economic toll of the war inside Russia, a stark domestic legal standoff in the U.S. regarding international war crimes, and finally, the colliding crises of climate policy and industrial collapse across Europe.
The situation between the U.S. and Iran has rapidly broken out into open, direct hostilities. We are currently in the 8th consecutive day of exchanged fire. Following an Iranian attack on a base in Jordan that tragically killed 2 American soldiers and left a 3rd missing, the United States launched several retaliatory strikes. The U.S. struck an under-construction nuclear power plant in the southwestern Iranian city of Darkovan, along with several targets on Qishm Island.
The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, had to step in to confirm that the Darkovan site is in the very early stages of construction and contains absolutely no nuclear material at this time. They issued an urgent plea for military restraint near any nuclear sites because striking infrastructure meant for nuclear power, even when it is incomplete, carries an almost unimaginable risk of catastrophic miscalculation.
Iran's retaliation, however, bypassed military installations entirely and went straight for civilian infrastructure. They struck a power and water distillation plant in Kuwait twice over the span of 2 days, which really forces us to question the severe degradation of the laws of war here. Striking a water plant in a desert nation is not a standard strategic military maneuver against an armed combatant. It operates effectively as an environmental siege on a civilian population.
Kuwait relies on desalinated water for about 90% of its daily drinking water. If those thermal distillation plants or reverse osmosis facilities are knocked offline, the municipal water pressure drops immediately. The grid fails, and you are looking at a massive civilian crisis developing almost overnight. Iran has also declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, issuing a very stark warning that any commercial or military vessels influenced by the U.S. face what they vaguely termed accidents.
Closing the Strait of Hormuz hits your household budget instantly, even if you live thousands of miles away. When a major artery of global trade is threatened like that, global maritime insurance rates spike out of control. Shipping companies are forced to either pay astronomical premiums or reroute their vessels thousands of miles around Africa, and that logistical nightmare translates directly into higher energy costs and widespread inflation at your local grocery store.
The regional fallout is already spreading well beyond the Gulf. Jordan had to intercept 3 Iranian missiles in its own airspace, which prompted a formal diplomatic protest sent directly to Tehran. The U.S. is reportedly deploying additional F-16 and F-35 fighter jets to the region to try and counter this escalation. We are even seeing secondary diplomatic fronts activate. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun is scheduled to meet with Donald Trump in Washington to discuss a framework for disarming Hezbollah.
That kind of deliberate targeting of logistics and essential energy infrastructure is mirroring what we are seeing play out in the Russia-Ukraine war, though with vastly different internal consequences for the Russian public. Earlier this week, Russia launched a massive wave of Iskander and hypersonic Zircon missiles, plus over 100 drones, directly at Ukrainian cities including Kyiv, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Sumy, resulting in at least 8 fatalities.
Ukraine retaliated forcefully by aiming straight at Russia's economic and logistical arteries. They struck 3 Russian oil tankers in the Black Sea and also hit 2 massive warehouses belonging to Russia's largest online retailer, Wildberries. Wildberries is essentially the Russian equivalent of Amazon, a logistics giant valued at roughly $12.6 billion. Those drone strikes in Tambov and Elektrostal also tragically resulted in 8 deaths.
But the ripple effects of those Ukrainian drone strikes inside Russian territory are creating this bizarre, highly strained domestic reality. To counter the attacks, the Kremlin has been forced to repeatedly shut down mobile internet networks across large swaths of the country.
The primary mechanism behind those internet blackouts is actually electronic warfare. The Russian military is deliberately jamming cellular frequencies to disrupt the navigation and targeting systems of those incoming Ukrainian drones. But shutting down the 4G network means modern point-of-sale systems in civilian areas simply do not work. Card payment terminals at pharmacies, corner shops, and salons lose their connection to bank servers entirely.
It is a striking irony. You have a modern authoritarian state that relies so heavily on digital surveillance and control, inadvertently forcing its own citizens completely off the digital grid. It is comparable to forcibly rolling a national economy back to the 1990s, not through some sophisticated cyber attack, but through the physical grinding realities of drone defense. And this is happening right as the Russian government hiked the value-added tax from 20% to 22% to fund their military operations.
That combination is devastating for state revenue. Since the start of the year, the central bank has had to add 1.56 trillion rubles, which is roughly $20 billion, in physical cash to circulation. The Russian state is now struggling to collect the taxes it desperately needs. When small businesses are squeezed by a slowing economy, higher taxes, and a non-functional digital payment grid, tax evasion just becomes a basic survival mechanism.
Shops are heavily relying on gray schemes just to stay afloat. They are asking customers to pay in unrecorded physical currency to keep transactions off the books, and they are increasingly paying employee wages in literal cash envelopes. This completely starves the state of revenue at the exact moment the government is relying on that 22% VAT hike to finance the conflict.
That concept of state authority and wartime legality fracturing is not just isolated to overseas conflicts. We are seeing a profound breakdown of consensus over international law right here in the United States. New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani recently announced he is actively exploring whether the New York Police Department has the legal authority to arrest Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he attends the UN General Assembly in September.
Mayor Mamdani is citing the International Criminal Court arrest warrant issued for Netanyahu over alleged war crimes in Gaza, specifically naming starvation as a method of warfare. This action puts local city governance in direct, hostile, rhetorical opposition to federal policy.
The Trump administration, which previously placed heavy economic sanctions on the ICC and firmly does not recognize its jurisdiction, completely dismissed the mayor's threat as pure political theater.
Looking at the actual legal mechanics of this, I have to be deeply skeptical about the constitutionality of this entire premise. Does a local NYPD officer actually possess any standing whatsoever to enforce an international warrant on a visiting head of state? Foreign leaders hold diplomatic immunity, especially when attending the United Nations on official business. This appears to be less about actionable law enforcement and more a stark indicator of how heavily fractured the American political consensus has become regarding international human rights. Local municipalities are openly treating federal foreign policy as illegitimate. Before we look at the localized consequences of shifting federal policies, for more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, visit clarenratio.com.
While that international legal drama is unfolding in New York, the Trump administration is aggressively dismantling domestic regulatory power in Washington. They are cutting election security staff, completely rolling back the 2009 EPA endangerment finding, and enacting significant cuts to public health funding. The endangerment finding is essentially the legal cornerstone for all federal climate regulation. It officially classified greenhouse gases as pollutants that threaten public health under the Clean Air Act. So removing it severely limits the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to regulate industrial emissions.
What is the exact physical mechanism linking these federal budget cuts to the localized health crises we are currently tracking?
Yeah.
Because the cuts to public health tracking have immediate biological consequences. Reduced agricultural and disease monitoring has already been linked to a nationwide outbreak of the Cyclospora parasite, which is typically a foodborne illness that requires extremely rigorous agricultural inspection to contain.
We are simultaneously seeing a rapid spread of the flesh-eating screwworm among livestock populations. Containing aggressive agricultural pests like the screwworm requires massive USDA monitoring and sterile fly release programs. Former officials have explicitly stated this current outbreak was directly exacerbated by delayed funding and suspended research initiatives. When you defund the federal inspectors responsible for tracking these biological threats, localized outbreaks very quickly escalate into national agricultural crises.
The physical consequences of altered environmental policies and shifting industrial strategies are highly visible right now in Europe, where the steep economic price of the green transition is coming due. Spain is currently battling fast-spreading wildfires north of Madrid and Guadalajara. Over 80,000 hectares have burned nationwide in 2026 alone, which is nearly double the area burned during the same period last year.
We are witnessing a sharp divergence in how nations respond to these massive environmental pressures. While the U.S. administration recently opened 500,000 square miles of protected Pacific Ocean waters to commercial use, Germany finalized a landmark deal to permanently protect the 12,000-year-old Hambach forest from coal mining. Local communities and environmental activists fought for half a century to prevent that ancient forest from becoming an open-pit lignite mine, securing a massive conservation victory.
Protecting that forest represents a major win for the climate. But Germany's broader industrial engine is stalling out under the weight of the green transition and fierce international competition. Volkswagen, which is historically the absolute bedrock of the German economy, is preparing to slash up to 100,000 jobs globally and close 4 domestic German factories. They are buckling under the high costs of domestic labor and are struggling to compete with Chinese electric vehicle makers like BYD.
Companies like BYD operate with significant technological advantages, much lower battery costs, and highly efficient, vertically integrated production models. The human cost of this European deindustrialization hits local municipalities brutally. Take the city of Oberhausen in Germany's Ruhr Valley. It was once a global powerhouse of steel production and heavy manufacturing, and today it is facing total financial collapse.
When the heavy industry left the region, the city shifted to lower-paying retail and service jobs, which absolutely devastated their tax revenue. Local German municipal finance relies heavily on business taxes. Without those manufacturing profits, Oberhausen's debt reached a staggering 2 billion euros before requiring a state bailout. The loss of heavy industry completely removes the tax base required to support a social safety net, leaving local governments unable to care for their most vulnerable citizens.
50% of Oberhausen's municipal budget is supposed to go to social services, youth welfare, and elderly care. They simply cannot afford to fund those mandates anymore. This reveals a brutal paradox at the heart of the modern climate strategy. Communities across Europe are successfully fighting to save their natural environments and reduce carbon emissions. But without a highly competitive, modernized industrial strategy to replace those old fossil fuel economies, they lose the economic engines required to sustain basic civic life.
You can save the ancient forest, but if the local factory closes and the commercial tax base evaporates, the city can no longer afford to run the youth centers, fix the roads, or fund the health clinics. The stories we covered for this briefing clearly do not fit into a single neat box. We are seeing distinct, massive pressures moving in completely different directions. Military forces are targeting basic human survival needs like drinking water in the Middle East, international legal norms are fraying on the streets of New York, and European cities are facing the agonizing trade-off between saving the natural environment and sustaining the industrial employment that funds their social safety nets.
The foundational contract between the state and the citizen is being severely tested by physical realities that completely outpace traditional policy tools. When a government cannot collect taxes because its citizens must use physical cash to avoid military internet blackouts, or when a municipality cannot fund elder care because the steel mills closed, grand geopolitical strategies suddenly become highly localized, deeply personal problems.
For listeners looking for slower, deeper context on the mechanics of that German industrial crisis, you can check out recent episodes of Debate Candy and Brain Candy, which leaves you with this final thought. The most profound shifts in history often happen far away from UN summit rooms or heavily guarded situation centers. They happen when local, everyday realities, like a Russian citizen needing physical cash just to buy groceries, or a German mayor having to shutter a community center to pay down municipal debt, collide with the grand ambitions of heads of state. Thank you for listening to the Clarin Ratio Daily World Brief. For more daily briefings and classic audiobooks, visit clarinhoratio.com.